So there are two reasons that an organization that's trying to create world change and a sustainable future needs to focus on great storytelling. And one is about the particular moment that we're in right now with the end of the broadcast era and this rise of social media and viral marketing. And the other is about how human beings work and how stories have always worked within society. So let's start first with what's happening in our media world and why stories are so important for anybody trying to get a message out there. For the first 100,000 or so years of human society that we know of, people lived in what's known as an oral tradition. And in the oral tradition, the way that ideas are passed between people is an idea is spoken, it goes into someone's brain, there it gets kind of changed, mixed up, moved around, and then it passes through social networks by a kind of permission. If someone finds the information interesting and compelling and important to them, they pass it along, otherwise it dies. And then about 100 years ago or so, we entered this time of the broadcast tradition, where the oral tradition is a kind of survival of the fittest world for ideas. The broadcast tradition is a survival of the richest kind of landscape, where whoever has access to these elite machines that broadcast information can put ideas out there, and then audiences are kind of captive. They don't have that many choices, and they take in that information regardless of whether it's something that would survive in the wilds of the oral tradition. So that really stunted the way that we communicated. And everyone who does public-facing communication or marketing now grew up in that tradition, and our entire landscape was shaped by it for several generations. And we kind of forgot what the oral tradition was all about when it comes to speaking outward. Now, with the end of the broadcast era, which we all understand is going away, something new is coming, and I call it the digitoral era because it's digitally empowered and it's also much more like the oral tradition. Here, ideas are owned by everybody again. They go into the brains and the computers and the minds of different people. They can recast it, mix it up, comment on it, like it, and then they choose to pass it on to their friends. And if they don't, it dies. So we're really returning to a much more oral tradition. And we know exactly what survives in the survival of the fittest landscape of the oral tradition, because every oral tradition society has left us with only one thing, and that's stories. We know their stories, and in fact, they permeate the kind of stories that we tell today from these ancient societies. Stories survive with their meaning intact over thousands of years and generations, even without writing. So when we want to enter this new oral tradition and we want to get people to notice our ideas and pass them along to their friends and their networks, we need to learn to tell better stories, because that's how humans are attracted to information. Now, the second part of this idea about the way human beings work in terms of how they express their values and create their identities, also tells us that stories are extremely important. You see, society is built, the DNA of society is built on the stories that we tell. A society can't quite control what happens to it, but it can orient itself in the direction of where it wants to go. And the way that societies orient themselves is by the myths that they create. Every society we know of has had myths, and those myths are a setting of intentions, a way of encapsulating values and passing them on to every generation within that society. So the way that we create myths actually tells people where we want to go. And we're never going to be able to create a sustainable society in time by getting small campaign wins one at a time and slowly changing people's behavior in a transactional way. We need to change their identities, how they see themselves and what their values are, and we need to connect their values to their behaviors. And that's where myths can really help. See, myths do combine four things. They give an explanation of how the world works. They give meaning, what it means in my own life. They give a story, they cast it in the world of a symbolic story, and they give us rituals, ways to enact those stories in our own lives. Now, we live in a time now called what I call a myth gap. You see, all other societies had these shared myths that had huge resonance for them, and a shaman or a storyteller would bring that to the society. But now, that's really kind of fractured, and our foundational myths are not universally shared across our global society. We have religion, and that does bring us explanation, meaning, but it doesn't really want to be called a story. It wants to be taken literally. So we don't have these shared belief in it in our more rational society, and we don't all share the rituals of religion. It's very fractured, so we don't find universal meaning there. Science provides us explanation of how the universe works, but it doesn't want to be called a story, and it's not about meaning either, except sort of on the fringes of science. Entertainment, also great at telling stories, but not really here to provide us with meaning and ritual to enact that meaning or explanation of how the world really works. Now, the one place that we really find story, explanation, meaning, and ritual all brought together in these universal packages is in the world of marketing. Marketers, take the Marlboro Man for instance, are really good at telling stories that we don't have to believe that they're real. Nobody really thinks the Marlboro Man exists, but inform our sense of self. We know that the products that we consume, like a Marlboro cigarette, gives us our sense of identity. We also know that there is that marketers are great at providing new explanations of how our world should work. Every time they put out a new product or a new idea, it creates a new explanation of how we should live our lives. And ritual, well, of course, we can just go into the marketplace and enact these stories in our own lives. So marketers have become our modern myth makers. And when we look around us, we can see how marketers have taken our society and created this consumer frenzy by creating these sort of inadequacy stories that make us feel that we don't have, that we're not smart enough or accepted enough or safe enough unless we consume their products. So the reason that we've been able to create this vast consumer society is that marketers have gotten really, really good at telling stories that make people think that to be a citizen, a member of society, means to be a consumer. So now as world changers, we face these two issues. One, this new oral tradition landscape, and two, this tradition of treating people like consumers, telling stories that create people to be consumers. And the problem is that us social marketers are copying all of the broadcast tradition style of communicating, and we're copying that sort of inadequacy approach to marketing, treating our supporters like people who need to consume our ideas and do what we say. And when we're doing that, we're really not tapping into the power that we have to create transformational stories that not only get people to sit up and take notice, but also change their identities to going back from thinking of themselves as consumers of solutions to citizens again, the kind of people who really change society. And what I think is really fascinating here is that somebody like Joseph Campbell, who studied myths across all times and found the commonalities between all myths, said that the single story, the hero's journey, what he called it, was about one thing. The stories that have survived the survival of the fittest landscape of the oral tradition are always about one thing. It's about an immature individual, think of Luke Skywalker for instance, who gets lured onto a journey of self-discovery and becomes a mature citizen who comes back with a reason and an ability to heal the world. So the stories that most stick are the stories that teach people how to grow up, go beyond themselves, and heal the world. I've had a lot of experience with this. We made a movie called The Story of Stuff, which was a examination of a materials economy. And most people told us you can't make a 20-minute viral movie because about the materials economy. Nobody wants that kind of complexity. They just want to be entertained. They just want to be told what to do. And we created a story world that takes people into an adventure to understand their stuff, to get more deeply involved in it and understand the technical complexities of how it's created and create new identities beyond consumers as citizens who want to reform the materials economy. We put it out there and it's been seen 17 million times and sparked an enormous movement because there's a hunger for these kind of stories that bring us into the world of truly understanding our world and inspiring us to be citizens again. And I've discovered that it's not just movies like The Story of Stuff or The Matrix, another big success that we had about helping people understand their factory farming and the food system, that are so powerful as stories. Marketers have actually been telling these stories that connect us to deeper values and an ideal of citizenship for a long time in a very subtle way. The most iconic campaigns have not taken this inadequacy approach, but things like Nike's Just Do It that tell us that life is not easy and that we need to reach deeply into ourselves for higher achievement, or the VW campaign, which cut the legs out of the conspicuous consumption of the Cadillac era and said, actually, a car is just a car. Let us tell you the truth. And you can't express your identity through the car you drive. You can express your identity through who you are as a human being. Or Apple's 1984 campaign, which made people believe that computers were all about individual expression, were all what I call empowerment marketing stories, much like Story of Stuff, that connect people to deeper human values and get them to express those values and not teach them that they need to simply be talked at and consume a solution through a product. So one very interesting thing about the history of advertising before we talk about how you actually build stories is that Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, was the person who invented PR and ran many of the first story-based campaigns in the 1950s. And he was actually the first one to bring Freud to the United States and popularize him in the United States. And he adopted his uncle's opinion of mankind to run his campaigns, which is that people are only motivated by fear, greed and the need for status and lust was the kind of things that they assumed. And it was a very powerful model in the broadcast era to create this consumer society. And if we take a Freudian view of the world, it is true that humans, we may believe that humans are only motivated that way. And many climate campaigners actually will tell you that people will only respond if you frighten them, or make it hit their pocketbook, or make them believe that future generations that they can see and touch will be harmed, and that you can't make people interested in anything beyond that sort of self-interest. But there's an alternative model as well to those values, which was discovered by Abraham Maslow in the 1950s and 60s. And he provided this very powerful alternative to Freud that really syncs up with what Joseph Campbell had to say about our desire to be citizens and part of something larger than ourselves. He said that yes, we're concerned with the needs of the body and the needs for esteem from our community, but really that people at any stage of development are seeking higher ideals as well. They're seeking to be part of something larger than themselves. They're seeking beauty in the world. They're seeking justice, an idea that the universe is ordered in a sort of way that makes sense. They're seeking richness, to understand the complexities of life. And he came up with these 9 core values of human growth, because Freud studied sick people. He studied his patients and they were all mentally ill. What Maslow did was studied healthy people, people who were maturing and developing. And he found just as surely as we do respond to fear and greed and lust and all that stuff, we also respond to calls and to values that speak to our higher natures and our higher selves. And again, what we know we need to do in society is get people to be focused more on their higher selves. And what Maslow said was that the more that you stimulate these fear and greed and lust, the more we dwell at those lower levels. So we have this media landscape that's keeping us dwelling at these lower levels, and yet there are universal values across all of humankind that reach for something higher. And that's what we need to be doing with what I call empowerment marketing. So let's talk a little bit about how values and stories relate, and so we can start building stories. We all are very familiar with the surface of a story. We've been told stories since we were 2 years old. We watch movies, we watch TV, and we all think we know stories because we know there are characters and they're in conflict with each other. There are settings and there's sort of plot that plays out. We all watch a movie and we know we can recite that stuff. It's very clear on the surface. But what we don't usually see unless we analyze it is that all of those characters and conflicts and settings are placed there for a very specific reason. The storyteller has a moral of the story, a kind of truth about how the world works that he or she wants us to get on board with and believe. And that's why we actually tell stories. We're teaching each other, when you find yourself in this situation, you may act like this character, and the destiny will be what you've observed in this story. That's why we so keenly listen to stories. That's why kids sit on their parents' knees and want to be told story after story after story, because they want simulations of what life might be like. They want to know how the world works, and that's the moral of the story. And a fable, for instance, will just throw the moral right at the end, so you can't miss it. More complicated stories just arrange all the action and all the characters. You may not know until the end why they were all there, but if it's a story well told, there's 2 reasons you might say a story is well told. One, it's all oriented around a single moral of the story, a truth about how the universe works. And 2, it's something that we intuitively believe can be true, but we haven't really thought of quite before. So the moral of the story is what gives a story good structure. And we can't really write good stories or create good social change brands unless we say everything that we say needs to be oriented around this is how the world works. Now, the surface of the story, the moral of the story is within it, but the moral of the story even encapsulates something deeper and more subtle, and those are values. So take a story whose moral may be, he who hesitates is lost. We know something about the storyteller when we hear that moral. We know the storyteller values safety and security and wants us to value that as well. And so when we hear that story, we're more likely to value safety and security. But a story, that's the opposite. So a story where the moral is he who hesitates is lost, the storyteller obviously values risk and adventure, taking chances and growth. So if we hear the story and say we shouldn't hesitate, we should go for it, then we will be more likely to act that way in our own lives. But a story where the moral is better safe than sorry, the storyteller obviously has a different set of values that he or she wants us to share, valuing safety and security and less risk. So the story is only well told when it's based on a set of values that we agree with, when it says something about how the world works that we think is true but actually expands our vision. And that's what makes a story well told. Now, if we want to get across to people how to grow and become citizens of a larger movement, we need to know what values we stand for and are trying to speak to. We need to be clear on what those values are, and we need to build a single moral of the story around which all the stories that we tell are consistent. So we are actually bringing them into a world that helps them better understand their universe. That's how stories are structured. And we can create a story strategy by building out from those inner core of values to moral of the story, to then picking the characters that go on the surface. So how do we start creating those characters and conflict and setting on the surface of the story? Well, that's the next step, to actually tell some stories. And this is where the hero's journey, I think, is extremely important. Joseph Campbell's idea that the best stories are all about a young person who sees that the world is broken but doesn't think that they can do anything about it. And when I say a young person, I mean someone who's not necessarily empowered. It's not always about age, but someone who's not quite matured into their power yet. They're not an obvious hero. They're just some person who's kind of muddling through. They know the world's broken, but they don't know what they can do about it. Then they meet somebody who catalyzes a new way of seeing themselves. They meet a mentor, so think Obi-Wan Kenobi, for instance. That mentor invites them on a journey of self-discovery, where they go into a totally different world, a different way of seeing the world, and come out the other side with a boon to society. Something, after they've faced their deepest fears and gone through hard trials, they have something to offer to help heal the world. So this is a kind of structure for a story that always works, and you can see it in The Matrix, and you can see it in The Odyssey and Star Wars. These are the stories that go viral and people want to hear again and again and again. So one of the first insights that I think is really important when we tell stories is to realize that we as an organization or a brand are not that hero, because the hero is an outsider, someone who's not yet empowered. So who is the hero of our stories? The hero of our stories is actually our audiences. Those are the people that we are trying to move to action. And if we're trying to move someone to action in this formula, who are we? Well, we're the mentor. We need to understand that the action does not reside in us and our own accomplishments and our own power, but in our audiences. And that we need to understand that they don't believe that they can simply save the world or change everything, because they're reluctant. And Joseph Campbell talks about this refusal of the call. No, not me, I can't do it kind of feeling. But what the mentor does is it speaks directly to the hero's sense of what's going on in their own lives right now, what's already important to them, shows them that we understand that we see the world broken in the same way that we do, and by appealing to their values makes that kind of call irresistible. One thing that's also really important to know about the mentor is that people want to have relationships. In the stories, the mentor always needs to kind of create a human relationship with the hero, but to get them moving. One of the great hero journey stories is the story of Moses. And one of the really interesting parts of that story is that God is the mentor in that story. And Moses is this 80-year-old shepherd who doesn't think he can do anything about Pharaoh, who's all powerful. And God comes down and says, you must go and free the people from Pharaoh. And Moses says, I stutter when I talk. I can't do that kind of thing. And God says, you must. He's God. He's ordering him to do it. But Moses says, I'm not going to do it because I don't know. He says, what is your name? I need to know your name before I can go. And God then comes to Moses and they speak for several days as God creates a personal relationship with Moses that actually gets him then to accept that call. And there's a lesson here for us as marketers and as social marketers, which is that we need to speak in a very human voice, not in an organizational voice, but we need to bring forth our own character, our own vulnerabilities to be that kind of mentor that moves our hero to action. The hero also gives the mentor also gives the hero what I call a brand gift, and that is like the lightsaber or the staff that makes that impossible journey feel possible. So when we are calling people to these deeper actions, we need to give them something special that makes that impossible journey feel possible. In the story of Stuff, Annie Leonard has this magic crayon that she can draw with and bring an animated whiteboard to life, and that suddenly makes the world seem extremely simple. Obama, as a candidate who was calling people on a hero's journey to yes, we can, brought forth this surprising internet savvy that no other candidate had that suddenly make this dark horse candidate seem exciting and ready to go. So when we think about our brand strategy as a story-based strategy, we need to see the hero of our story as the audience, not ourselves. We need to see ourselves as a really human character, not an organizational character, but learn to speak in our own human voice. And we need to offer some kind of special gift that helps the hero want to believe that they can do it. So what does our organization really offer that this really makes us feel that with this organization we can achieve amazing things? And around some of those concepts we can start to build a story strategy. Now, how do we actually build stories from there that go viral, that everybody wants to see? Well, I'll give you 3 core concepts that I think really work to make stories travel, that I learned several times over through making videos that went massively viral. And I'll do that through this insight that the human brain has not changed very much in 70,000 years. I had this really interesting experience when I made this movie, The Matrix, about the factory farming system. And that was, people had been trying to get people to be horrified by the way meat was produced and change the way they eat for 20 years. And they kept throwing pictures of bloody chickens and dead cows and disgusting pictures at people, and no one really seemed to care. And we made this spoof of The Matrix that was funny, that was cute, and that told a real story. And suddenly, the issue blew up, and we got about 25 million viewers to see it and totally changed the conversation. And I try to figure out, well, why did that work? And that search led me to some really interesting insights about neurology and about how the human brain works, because we're flooded with information right now. And to get something to go viral, you need to speak right to the sort of ancient brain that just doesn't respond on rationality, but responds just to stories that attract our minds. So I started doing some research on evolutionary biology and discovered some interesting things. One, that explained the Matrix. One is that the human brain has not changed very much since we have a common male ancestor about 70,000 years ago. We have a common female ancestor about 120,000 years ago. So we all came from the same person, and our brain has not changed structurally in that time almost at all. And so what appealed to our ancient ancestors is also what appeals to us. As we search the field for all information we might want to consume, we still think like a caveman, basically. Now, three things were very interesting to our ancestors. The first thing that we know is that other human forms and faces, a huge amount of our brain is taken to understand what other humans' intentions are and what's on their mind by looking at their faces. And so that was critical in these small social societies that we lived in. And still, our brains scan the landscape for other human beings. And this is, of course, why it's so important to have true characters in our story, not just facts and figures and ideas, but characters that embody them. But there's a certain kind of character that really captures our attention, and I call them freaks, because they're characters that break expectation of what a character should do. So if you're a person, ancient ancestor, you live in a tribe of about 80 people, when you see somebody who is very different than anyone you've seen before, that's an enormous moment of both danger and possibility. Your mind goes right to them. I've never seen someone like that. Are they from another tribe? Who are they? What are they doing? What do I need to do to respond to them? And so one trick is to make sure that we populate our stories with people who break our expectation, not the sort of stereotypical activist or stereotypical character. We know, oh, that kind of person does this, and that's what they wind up doing. We need characters that are visually arresting, that behave in ways that we don't expect, that are the most unlikely people to be in that situation. These kind of characters capture our attention. So when you showed a dead, bloody chicken, no one wants to look at that. But an anthropomorphized animal is one of the most attractive kind of freaks we know of. In fact, many gods were always anthropomorphized animals. They're so strange and different that our minds zone in on them. So we need to create compelling characters that are freaks, that are different and break all expectations of what that character is about to do, and embody our stories in the experience of those characters. The second is called cheats. Now, people have this unique evolutionary problem, which is that they're social animals who need to be able to hunt together and cooperate, but evolution would tell us that we all need to compete, right? We all want to get the most of the kill that we can. But if we're all competing, we can't really work together. So we believe that stories were created to actually help people believe that people who cheat the system are going to be punished. Some people think the whole reason that humans believe in God is to think that there's always someone watching you to punish the cheats out there. And many, in fact, most stories are based on people who break the norms of society and are either punished or get away with it. Ancient stories, we want to see people who break the norms of society punished, like Sisyphus, who had to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity because he was a bad host as an innkeeper. It teaches us to reinforce those social norms. But in our modern society, we actually have a lot of social norms that we detest, and the people who break them are rebels, like the characters in The Matrix, for instance, who are trying to fight against this oppressive machine. But in any case, what's common about stories that really work is the stories create conflict because you find people who are fighting against norms in society that we can identify with and we either want to protect or bring down. So we need to tell stories that are full of that kind of action, people resisting these powerful norms, and embody villains who either represent those detested norms or who are trying to tear down norms that we love. We need to create stories that have high levels of conflict that between the way that society actually works and the way that someone who wants to change it is creating it. And that's, again, why the story of these rebel animals trying to overthrow the factory farming machine was so attractive, because it taps into cheats. And finally is the concept of familiars. As we go out and try to make our characters as freakish and different as possible, we also need to understand and remember our brand heroes, the people we're trying to reach and motivate to action. And remember that they need to be able to identify in some way with the story. They need to understand this is a story for me and for my tribe, because we would always look to storytellers who would help us create a sense of identity and tribalism. So we need to tell stories that aren't just shouting from the rooftops about what we believe and who we are and what we think is important. We need to go and find out where our audiences and our heroes are having their own conversations and insert ourselves into those conversations. Bring them along slowly from what they're thinking about right now to where we want them to be. The story of Stuff starts with Annie Leonard holding up an iPod and simply saying, do you have one of these? And immediately we recognize, oh, this is a story from my tribe, because most of us have iPods. Or we timed the Matrix to be released right at this media moment of the Matrix and made this spoof that people could identify with, which brought the story well beyond the choir. So we can use these three markers of freaks, cheats, and familiars to easily start creating stories that are more compelling. If we tie them back to that moral of the story and know what values we're trying to produce from our story strategy, we can start creating coherent stories that both gain attention and actually get people to move and act, and most importantly, try to get them to create new identities and enter a conversation about how we can create a better society, and not just see them as activists that we can press a button and get them to do what we want. We want them to change sort of how they think about themselves, what they think is important, and what they derive pleasure, happiness, and the direction they want to see the world go from.